Hello and welcome to this catch-up session for Early Career Framework, Module 4, Early Career Teacher Seminar 2. I'm sorry you weren't able to join us for the live session. We really hope that you'll be able to do so next time. My name is Caroline Phipps. I'm a development lead with Teach First and I'll be guiding you through this catch-up session today. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the presentation and take a few minutes to reflect on a statement about assessment before we start. Before we begin, please reflect on the following statement. All assessment helps pupils learn. Consider to what extent you agree or disagree with the statement on screen, where 5 is strongly agree and 1 is strongly disagree. Please pause the presentation to note your response and your reasons why. Thank you. Welcome back. There are many different uses of assessment and not all of these are beneficial to learning. However, the purpose of formative assessment is to support learning. We will be looking at this in much greater detail today with a focus on peer and self-assessment. So let's make a start. The purpose of today's seminar is to develop your understanding of assessment, specifically the role of peer and self-assessment in supporting learning. It is envisaged you have already used or frequently use this as part of your practice currently. We'll be looking at assessment broadly before narrowing into peer and self-assessment. Today, we hope you can develop your understanding of assessment beyond the what to the how and why it is an important area of your practice. Here are the objectives for this seminar. Please pause the presentation now for a minute or two to read and understand them. Thank you. Let's take a moment to review the early career framework statements that have informed this seminar. Please take a moment to read and understand these early career framework standards. These are not all the statements from Standard 6, just the ones pertinent to this seminar. Please pause briefly now. Let's begin by considering the role of formative assessment. To begin with, we will revisit some key ideas related to assessment. So let's explore how assessment is used in schools. Take a moment to think about how broad the topic of assessment is in schools and all the possible uses of assessment that take place within schools. On screen are just 10 of the possible uses suggested by Professor Paul Newton, an expert on assessment and research chair at Ofqual. Reasons why assessments may take place in schools include school monitoring to determine rising or falling standards, perhaps at a multi-academy trust, regional or even national level. Formative assessment to support learning by identification of pupils' needs. Teacher evaluation to determine pay progression. Summative assessment to determine if a pupil has passed a course. Social evaluation where a pupil may rank themselves amongst their peers or social circle. Selection, such as for entry to selective schools or courses. Guidance, where individuals are given suggestions for future educational and employment routes. School choice, to identify which school parents desire their child to attend. Placement, where individuals are placed in sets or streams based on performances in previous assessments. And finally, diagnosis, such as screening tests for dyslexia. Take a moment to think about which of these are of greatest interest to you as a classroom teacher and make a note of them. Please pause briefly now. Of these 10, It's likely that formative and summative assessment are the uses that will interest you most as a classroom teacher. These have the potential to drive learning in the classroom, and we'll move on to take a look at the differences between the two. Professor Stuart Keim has discussed when we might use formative and summative assessment in the self-directed study materials, but it will be helpful to think more deeply about their distinguishing characteristics. There are three simple distinctions of purpose, timing, and focus. For formative tasks, they will serve the purpose of supporting learning. The timing is embedded throughout a course of learning, and the focus is typically on a small area of content. Summative assessments, conversely, are typically used to evaluate pupils' learning, with summative assessments taking place at the end of a course, and they include a broad range of subject matter. Take a moment to look at the three examples on screen. Are they examples of formative or summative assessment? Why do you think this is? Please press pause briefly now to note your answers and reasoning before we go through them all together. Thank you. Let's go through each example. The Year 1 phonics test or screening check. This is usually considered to be an oral summative assessment of a 6-year-old's phonics ability of about 40 words. The purpose is for assessing progress and school monitoring. The timing is at the end of Key Stage 1, and the focus is on a pupil's ability to use phonics to read simple words. However, it is dependent on how it's used. If the data from a phonics screening check is used to inform teaching and learning by feeding back into the classroom, it can be argued that it is being used as a formative assessment. Number 2, questioning. This is an oral formative assessment. The purpose is to provide information as to whether pupils are competent in an area to move on. The timing is during a lesson at a hinge point, and the focus is on a key concept or idea. Number 3, self-grading of a test. This is interestingly a written summative assessment. It is not formative, as the purpose is to support pupils to grade their work and give an evaluation of their learning, not to support learning taking place. The timing will be after a test which takes place typically at the end of a unit of study. The focus of such tests is usually a whole unit of work. As with all summative assessment, it is possible to use this assessment in a formative way, but only if there are activities designed to support future learning, such as self-reflection, to identify the next steps in their learning. The purpose of formative assessment is to support learning. Any information to the learner should not generate an emotional response that would otherwise hinder learning, such as grade fixation that may arise in the third example. On the surface, that is a good idea, but in reality requires careful thought. Peer and self-assessment activities can be both formative and summative, and we will be focusing today on formative self and peer assessment. Let's now look at effective feedback in a little more depth. Formative assessment is key in providing guidance to assist learning in improving the pupil's performance to form the learner as part of the learning process. So how we provide the guidance is key. This is why effective feedback is important. Fortunately, the research on feedback in classrooms is very consistent. Sometimes feedback from teachers can be vague and unhelpful. Add more detail. Be more specific. Present your information more clearly. Well done. These types of vague feedback can be confusing and frustrating for pupils, as if they knew what detail they needed, they probably would have done it in the first place. They also do not know what they have done well unless we tell them as teachers. As shown on screen, Professor Dylan William of the University College London Institute of Education reminds us that feedback should be the recipe for future action. It isn't formative unless a pupil is able to act on it in the future. It should focus on what they need to do to improve rather than how well they have done, trying to avoid comparison with others. Let's look now at what effective feedback entails. So, thinking about what we have discussed in relation to formative assessment and feedback, here are 4 examples of how a teacher might provide feedback and information to learners following an assessment. We are going to evaluate whether these help or hinder learning, and therefore whether they have a role to play in formative assessment. First, scoring or grading, whereby pupils are given a grade that summarises their overall attainment. Second, for a particular task or problem, the pupils are given a minimum set of guidelines on how to arrive at the correct answer, or a scaffold. This is opposed to giving pupils the completed solution. Thirdly, the timing of the feedback to pupils being immediate. And finally, the use of praise. You now need to consider whether you feel that these are helpful or unhelpful in supporting learning. Where would you place each of these 4 on this line, from unhelpful to helpful? Take 2 minutes to decide on the line where you would place each one. You may wish to draw out this on a piece of paper and write down your answers. Consider why you have placed each element in the position that you have. Please pause the presentation to do this now. Welcome back. Let's go through these in a little more detail. So first, we have scoring or grading, and the research in this area is quite interesting. The first attempts to study how to use self-assessment to influence pupils' learning was to ask them to grade their work with little reflection. This has little impact. Further research has found that when providing grades and comments, it led to improved progress for girls and had a negative impact on boys. It widened the gap between high and low achieving pupils, with low achieving boys being particularly negatively affected. It is theorised that these pupils have a fixed view on success as being linked to ability which they cannot control and therefore cannot influence. So, for the most part, grades can actually be very damaging to pupils' learning. Research on scaffolding has found that a set of pupils given feedback in the form of a scaffolded response or the minimum amount of support to help solve the problem made better progress and retained more information. This aligns with the view that feedback should provide a recipe for future action. It is important that this is pitched at the correct level, as the expertise reversal effect suggests that too much scaffolding can slow progress if they are competent in areas. Research on the timing of feedback is an area that is a little unclear. We could be providing immediate feedback to learners or delaying feedback to provide time to forget, which according to the content you covered in Module 2 is beneficial to learning. A key message on feedback is just in time, and that is going to depend on a few areas. Immediate feedback is helpful for learners to correct during a task and often focuses on the performance of a task or problem. It is useful in addressing relatively simple learning outcomes with a lower level of processing about a task. Conversely, delayed feedback can be helpful for more complex tasks that take a longer duration, perhaps a more extended piece of work, and is more effective when focused on the process of a task. And what about praise? Praise given alongside feedback had been shown to have a potentially negative effect on achievement. Pupils focus on their ego rather than their work, and that may in fact lower future effort and performance. It does not align with the view that feedback should not provide an emotional response. If we are providing the praise sandwich when giving feedback to mitigate negative comments, evidence has shown it is confusing for pupils and can potentially lead to learned helplessness. It's not that you need to stop praising pupils, but we need to clearly distinguish between praise and feedback. And when you do give praise, it must be task-focused rather than ego-focused. Related to this, the culture of your classroom is also really important, and we'll cover this towards the end of the catch-up session. So we will now take a deeper look at formative self and peer assessment and consider how the principles of assessment can be used to inform our planning and practice. First, we will consider what threats exist when using peer or self-assessment. If we want to ensure an assessment is effective at supporting learning and avoid some of the problems with peer and self-assessment, we must consider the threats to a robust assessment. On the slide, you can see 4 examples of where the quality of assessment could be threatened. Please take a moment to read these 4 examples. These 4 examples relate to 4 key principles of assessment. The 4 key principles, their definitions, and their relative importance in the context of classroom assessment are the subject of ongoing debate, but can be helpful as a way of considering how tasks are designed. Let's take a look now at each example and how they reflect the key principle of assessment. We have mentioned purpose previously. It is what is driving the assessment activity. If the formative assessment is not intended to support learning and the assessment itself demotivates pupils, then it is not fit for purpose. A summative assessment might have a very different purpose, such as deciding if someone is ready to enter their next phase of study. You might recall that validity was mentioned in the previous seminar on hinge questioning. It is broadly defined as how well an assessment measures what it is supposed to. Another way of thinking about it is to consider whether any differences in assessment data reflect differences in the underlying ability or understanding. Thirdly, reliability. A car is reliable if it starts when it's needed to. An assessment is reliable if it generates the correct data we need when we need it to. Reliability often focuses on the marking of an assessment. For example, if you took the same assessment and 3 different pupils marked it, would they all produce the same judgment? If not, then there is a reliability issue with the data generated by these pupils. Fairness is a very important notion in our classroom. A fair assessment should maximise opportunities for everyone to progress, as well as meeting pupil and teacher expectations. A teacher assessment that requires a huge amount of teacher input is arguably unfair. Now we have reviewed the 4 key principles with some examples. Over the next few minutes, please consider how we can ensure each key principle is met during a peer or self-assessment. Pause the presentation now for a few minutes to note down how each principle can be met during peer or self-assessment. Please pause now. Welcome back. Let's just summarise some of the key takeaway points from this section. Here are 4 takeaway points to consider when designing assessment tasks. Please pause the presentation to read through this slide now. Welcome back. If we use the principles, they can be helpful in designing assessments that really help to drive learning. As reminded by Statement 6K of the Early Career Framework, you need to carefully consider how any feedback generated is specific and helpful to peers or individuals. This ensures your assessment is fit for purpose in driving learning, as well as prompting reflection on how feedback may be generated through a reliable peer or self-marking process. We will take a look at this in greater detail towards the end of the seminar. But now we are going to look at peer and self-assessment in more depth. A reminder for you to note is that the value of peer and self-assessment is that it is a highly effective way of understanding what pupils know. Peer feedback in particular is capable of generating feedback for learners in much greater volume and immediately than your feedback. A peer marker, who is obviously less skilled than a teacher, can produce an assessment of equal reliability and validity if given appropriate support. This might all seem quite academic, but teachers' knowledge of assessment is correlated to pupil outcomes. It also underlines why we must plan for peer and self-assessment, which we will now take a look at. To begin with, we will break down factors that will drive your peer assessment, and we will start by looking at 3 areas of peer and self-assessment. As I mentioned in the previous slide, drawing on Professor Dylan Williams' work on formative assessment, we will be taking a look at 3 areas in more detail. They are learning objectives, which you may have heard referred to as learning intentions, success criteria, which are sometimes referred to as WILFs or steps to success. We'll also be looking at rubrics. We will now review these 3 areas through the scenario of a Key Stage 2 geography lesson on climate change within the unit of weather and climate. You will then have some self-reflection time to consider your own example based upon an upcoming lesson where you anticipate that peer and self-assessment would be beneficial. Let's start then with learning objectives. A driving factor in designing an effective peer and self-assessment is related to the purpose. How will the assessment drive learning forward? For us to be able to do this, we need to be able to clearly identify and share the learning that is going to take place in the lesson and/or the activity. As previously mentioned, many researchers and authors may call these learning intentions, but in England the term learning objective is more popular, so we'll stick with this. You may also be familiar with them as the acronym WALT, or What Are We Learning Today? The acronym can also be known as We Are Learning Too. Doug Limov, author of Teach Like a Champion, considers one of the key differences between a good teacher and a great teacher to be dictated by the 80-20 rule and learning objectives. In his opinion, a good teacher will spend 80% of their planning time thinking about activities and tasks, with just 20% left to refine the learning objective. A great teacher, however, in his view, will do the opposite. Spend 80% of their planning time thinking carefully about the learning objectives and pupil outcomes, leaving the remaining 20% to focus on tasks. You may not agree, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but it is something to think about when you are a busy teacher and planning a large amount of lessons in a week. According to Professor John Hattie, author of Visible Learning, there are some key aspects of learning objectives to pay attention to. Firstly, they make the learning explicit and clear to pupils. It also means that you are clear in your own mind what you are hoping to achieve and how you might be able to recognise and see success. It can be helpful to think carefully about the knowledge, understanding and skills that are driving the lesson. Using to know, to understand and to be able to as part of the start of your learning objectives can be helpful. We'll take a look at some examples in a minute. They should be inclusive and therefore differentiation will happen within the activity rather than the whole lesson. The learning objectives should drive the peer and self-assessment, not the other way around. The same is true for activities. The learning objectives do not relate to these. Learning objectives should be explicit and clear so that they provide a shared sense of commitment and an agreed understanding of the goal or lesson or activity. A good learning objective is also generalisable so that they are able to apply the proposed knowledge or skill to another area of the subject or a future lesson. A final point is to ensure that you are referring frequently to your learning objectives in order to avoid simplistic or limited impact. The term wallpaper objectives have been used to describe learning objectives that are put upon a board and are there for show rather than to support learning. On screen now are 3 possible learning objectives for our lesson related to Key Stage 2 Geography. Pause the presentation to take a moment to think about which one you think is the most appropriate and why. Please pause to do this now. Thank you and welcome back. The correct answer in this example is B, to know why the atmosphere is changing. Both A and C relate to activity and what pupils will be doing, whereas B is the only learning objective that describes what they are learning about. To summarise, be explicit with your learning objectives so that you know what you want pupils to know before planning. Be sure to share your objectives, refer to them frequently, and avoid asking pupils to copy them out if you can. Imagine the opportunity cost against other learning activities. Now let's look at how we can communicate to pupils what they should be doing. Success criteria are an extension of the learning objectives and are the outputs of learning. They are not the same thing, as you will know from observing what the pupils have done in the lesson time. A useful acronym is WILF, or What I Am Looking For. So why are success criteria important? Success criteria provide focus during the activity by making explicit the output or evidence that the learning has taken place. We could just ask pupils what they know, but that will not be a very reliable measure of whether the learning has in fact taken place, especially for some pupils. For self and peer assessment, they are particularly important in establishing the criteria on which they will be judging the work of their peers or themselves. The success criteria can communicate what you consider to be valuable in the classroom. Importantly, they also set the level of challenge and communicate the value of learning time. Whilst on task, it allows for pupils to engage in metacognitive thinking and monitor their ongoing efforts against the success criteria. They can then engage in corrective feedback or seek help. As with learning objectives, they should be the same for all learners. The differentiation should happen within the activity, such as providing a writing frame to support the writing of the definition of a key term. These should be shared to and referred to throughout the lesson by you and your pupils. It can be helpful to discuss the success criteria you may be looking for with pupils and take the time to co-construct success criteria together to generate buy-in from pupils and to scaffold the task process. In our geography example, you can see the success criteria are clearly linked to the learning objective. How could you share success criteria in a lesson? Please pause for a few minutes to make some notes on how you could do this. Welcome back. Success criteria that are clearly related to a task can be communicated through the use of examples that show what a high-quality piece of work may look like. You may have heard this referred to as a waggle, what a good one looks like, and we're going to look at this next. The use of a high-quality example, sometimes called a waggle, which stands for what a good one looks like, is very effective at showing pupils what success looks like. The very detailed example brings our learning objective and success criteria to life for pupils. However, you may see how you may be contributing to a lot of cognitive load for pupils. You might remember that modelling is one of Rosenshine's principles covered in Module 3. For a simpler task, you could model your expert thinking by providing a step-by-step breakdown of how you achieve success, which can then be replicated in the task and in the marking during your assessment and the pupil peer assessment task. The co-construction of these can be really powerful in setting clear expectations of a task. And you may ask pupils to predict or suggest what may be on your waggle and write a brief list. As you reveal elements of the waggle on the board or visualiser, they can cross off their correct guesses and provide feedback on whether they understand what is required for the task. You don't have to be the author of the waggle yourself. You could use a visualiser or previous assessments to draw attention to the qualities of excellent work in this subject area. For pupils, providing feedback in peer and self-assessment, it can be helpful to have a waggle so that they can compare their own or peers' work to one illustrating all elements of the success criteria. However, for a peer assessment, you may wish to have a simpler check to see if they are meeting the specific success criteria. Or, instead of a waggle, you could use a simple checklist like this to facilitate quick and effective feedback, or you could combine the two to produce a visual checklist. You could use this as an opportunity to emphasise the key aspects of learning and your classroom culture. Again, these could be constructed with pupils in the lesson or prepared beforehand. Let's take some time now for you to apply your learning. You have seen the example of learning objectives and success criteria, and you now have time to create your own learning objectives and success criteria for an upcoming lesson in your class using the key guidance on screen. Please also take this as an opportunity to note any questions you may have to discuss with your mentor, and your reflections when you have completed the task to reflect on how challenging you found it. It may be new to you or something that you're very familiar with. Make some notes about this too. Please pause the presentation to do this now. Welcome back. Let's now move on to explore how rubrics can be used. So what are rubrics? According to Professors Malini Reddy and Heidi Andrade, rubrics are documents that articulate the expectations of an assignment by listing the criteria for what is important for that assignment and by describing levels of quality on a scale from excellent to poor, and this is from 2010. Rubrics have three main features: success criteria, a description of the standards or quality at different levels, and a way of marking such as scoring or highlighting. A rubric should provide pupils with adequate goals for tasks and allow pupils to reach an acceptable standard. A simple rubric is on the screen for you to show very young pupils how they might improve their drawings. you can see there is the opportunity to score them. A point to note that when you're scoring formative assessment, it is recommended that you record the marks as raw numbers or percentages and avoid grading as we mentioned earlier. Let's now move on to look at why we should be using rubrics. So why use rubrics? Well, pupils and teachers both benefit from the use of rubrics. You benefit as teacher by clarifying your own success criteria, reducing your workload and scoring work fairly. Research on rubrics has shown that they can have a positive impact on learning. Their use increases self-regulation and decreases negative thoughts oriented on performance. They increase self and peer assessment score accuracy and increases the self-efficacy on future tasks. For example, I've followed a rubric and done well before, so I think I can do it again. Studies exploring pupils' perceptions have also found positive results, with rubric use decreasing anxiety and helping them feel more secure. They are also liked more by pupils when compared to other assessment tools. However, pupils sometimes feel that rubrics can often focus on areas that only the teacher considers important and ignores areas that are relevant to them. For example, the rubric does not measure how much effort they put into their work. So let's review now how we should be using rubrics. So how can you use rubrics? It is important to design the rubric, keeping pupils as the end users and in a language that they understand. Co-creation can also engage pupils in negotiating the criteria that are relevant to them and ensure that pupils can recognise the value of their use. This activity could be conducted as a form of retrieval practice if approaching an assessment task. Let's look at some different types of rubrics. There are two main types of rubric, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. The example on screen is an holistic rubric which looks at all assessment criteria simultaneously. They provide a quick way of conducting peer and self-assessment, particularly at the end of a task. However, they are not particularly good at communicating what needs to improve. Therefore, they are not as informative as the second type of rubric we will now explore. Let's look at an analytical rubric. The second type of rubric is an analytical rubric, which in this example shows how the success criteria links to different standards of performance. They give helpful diagnostic information for pupils on the state of their work and feedback on how they can improve. They can also be clearly linked to instruction by breaking down the tasks into separate criteria. You can add scores together for a number of criteria which give a sense of overall performance on the task and motivate pupils to improve their score. These require far more judgments to be made by pupils during peer and self-assessment, therefore taking more time compared to an holistic rubric. They are very versatile and adaptable, and you could also easily support the peer assessment with follow-up reflection tasks on how pupils can improve their score. It is worth noting that these rubrics can also be used for summative assessment and teacher feedback. So now you have another opportunity to apply your learning. You have seen the example of learning objectives and success criteria, and you now have time to pause the presentation and to create your own rubrics. Here are two examples on screen. Please pause to complete the following tasks. Firstly, craft your own rubrics for a peer or self-assessment task for your upcoming lesson that you wrote the success criteria and objectives for earlier. Note any questions you may have and make some notes to answer the two questions you can see on the slide. Please pause the presentation to do this now and restart when you've completed the tasks. Welcome back. I hope that was a really useful exercise for you. We will now consider how to embed the use of peer and self-assessment. We will finish off this catch-up session today by looking at aspects of embedding formative assessment within your classroom. Let's consider the merits of peer and self-assessment. There is little in the way of research on whether a teacher should choose to use peer assessment over self-assessment, highlighting the role of a teacher's professional judgment. On screen is an example of a task known as a concept cartoon, related to a future lesson from the geography example we discussed earlier, focusing on climate change within the weather and climate unit in geography. Take a few moments to consider this concept cartoon. After the pupils have written their own response, would you use peer or self-assessment to see, in this case, if they have understood the human causes of climate change? There are also some questions on the slide to support your reflections further. Please pause the presentation to do this now and restart when your reflections are complete. Thank you. Let's now take a look briefly at comparative judgments. Research has suggested that it is possible for a teacher to judge responses accurately and quickly through a process known as comparative judgment. First trialled in classrooms in 2005, this is a field that is growing in interest due to the relatively low workload for teachers if well thought out. Comparative judgment is likely to continue to develop with the adoption of digital technology reducing teacher workload, and has even been found to be an effective way of marking high-stakes summative exams. The example on screen shows 4 responses, A to D, of different colour grades. Through repeated rounds of comparison between pairs of colours, you can infer a ranking from darkest to lightest. You could achieve the same if you were comparing work and end up with a ranking of strongest to weakest. There are software packages and websites that can do this for you, but a low-tech version that applies to peer and self-assessment is laying work on a table and simply sorting them until the assessor is happy with the rank order. If this is an extended piece of work, such as a piece of writing, it is much quicker than comparing each piece of work against a mark scheme or checklist. In fact, it has shown promising results in older pupils, being very effective peer assessors without a set of rigorous marking criteria. You may use this as an exercise of delayed feedback when revisiting a previous piece of work, or during the middle of a task when you want to ensure all pupils are aware of how well they are progressing against the success criteria. So, how can you ensure that effective peer and self-assessment is embedded in your teaching? Let's explore this now. Doug Lemov describes classroom culture as making your classroom a place where pupils work hard, behave, model strong character, and do their best. When thinking about classroom culture, there are a number of aspects of peer and self-assessment worth considering. Professor Stuart Kime made 4 key recommendations in your self-directed study that we can relate to today's content. The modelling of self and peer assessment with clear examples will build the expertise of your learners and help establish peer and self-assessment as part of your classroom culture. Consider the first module, which looked at routines. Which elements of these assessments could be embedded as part of routine? How will you practice and refine them over time? You cannot expect learners to become experts at peer or self-assessment overnight. Consider the instructions and how it sits with the flow of the lesson. The use of success criteria makes it clear what pupils are working towards, allowing them to develop their metacognitive strategies to monitor and evaluate their progress. Promoting the belief that ability and proficiency is incremental rather than fixed will help them to remain committed to improve. Allowing independence for pupils to use the success criteria provides the opportunity for you to let go and can significantly reduce your workload. Peer assessments allow you to not be the only conduit of all teaching activity and for pupils to take on more responsibility and to become more autonomous as learners. You can make the most of this independent time by gathering feedback on your teaching. Professor Dylan William, whose work on formative assessment with Professor Paul Black is one of the most cited papers in education, joked that he had wished he had called formative assessment responsive teaching. Peer and self-assessment can generate valuable feedback to you, allowing you to adapt your teaching to meet the needs of your pupils. The feedback generated in self and peer assessment is extremely valuable, so you should plan time in your lesson for pupils to make desired improvements. Throughout this catch-up session, I hope you have gained some insight into planning assessments to ensure that the feedback is purposeful and avoids an emotional response. Something as innocent as a thumbs up or smiley faces on a rubric may be demotivating for a small group of pupils. So it's important that learners perceive their feedback as being within their control, an issue highlighted by the research on grading mentioned earlier. Take a moment to think about how you could adapt your practice to implement more effective self and peer assessment. It should be something you can do really quickly, as soon as next week. Please pause the presentation to do this now. Thank you. Let's consider how teachers can think carefully about how to ensure feedback is helpful and specific, and explore some practical applications in the classroom. Let's now bring together what you have learnt in this session. We will consider this under 3 headings: model, instruct, and monitor. First, when asking pupils to carry out peer or self-assessment, you need to model how to do this effectively with your class. You will be familiar with these techniques from Module 3. For example, when discussing how to conduct the peer or self-assessment task, you could review with the class an example that meets the success criteria or rubric. You could also model a non-example that does not meet the success criteria or rubric. You may be able to do this using a visualizer so that you are able to think aloud when applying the success criteria, making it explicit which part of the work is effective and what needs more improvement. By thinking carefully about what you share with the class and how you model the assessment process, you are beginning to enable your pupils to be more reliable markers. Using success criteria, a rubric, or a set of questions you can pose for pupils to use enables you to instruct on what pupils are looking for. You are guiding them to identify what is and what is not effective in a piece of work. We know that any rubric needs to be clear in language so that pupils can easily understand, and linked directly to how pupils can progress in an area of learning. Rubrics, success criteria, or a set of questions need to be designed to scaffold pupils to understand how they can make improvements and continue to progress. In other words, your instruction should be designed with the end user, the pupils, in mind. As we mentioned earlier, you can't expect pupils to master self or peer assessment overnight, but you may be able to gradually remove scaffolds as pupils develop their competence and confidence. Monitoring to ensure that feedback is helpful is a key area that you need to consider carefully. As you are planning the use of self-assessments, ask yourself the following questions. How will you know if pupils have understood and engaged with the feedback? What do you expect pupils to do with that feedback? How will you know if the feedback has resulted in progress for the pupil? To monitor the impact of feedback and to check if it is specific and helpful, you will need to give time for pupils to act on it. For feedback to be helpful, there needs to be an opportunity to use it. Your school will already have a policy on feedback, such as the STAR method, 2 stars and a wish, or what went well and even better if. Pupils then have space to act on it before you, as teacher, are able to respond and check whether it has resulted in progression. When you instruct pupils to act on feedback given, track the room to see if pupils are engaged with it. Provide live feedback to the class, being explicit about where progress has been made as a result of the actions that they are taking. Let's summarise your learning and consider what you may be able to implement from this session. Today, you have examined the purpose and principles of formative assessment and taken the time to pick apart what makes for effective peer and self-assessment tasks. On screen now are 3 actions you can take away to try and implement in the very near future. Please pause the presentation now while you read through these tasks and make any notes. When we come back, we'll wrap up this session. Welcome back. I hope that you now have some clear next steps for your future practice. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this catch-up session. I hope it was useful and will make a real difference to your practice as a teacher. Thank you again and goodbye.